Imagine a congressional hearing, so tense that one moment silenced an entire room. Documents placed on the table didn't just challenge the words of a powerful figure, they changed the direction of the conversation. In this case, Jasmine Crockett revealed papers that left Pam Bondi with no defense, no counter, and no escape from the truth that was unfolding in front of cameras and the public eye. It wasn't about political sides. It was about one person daring to place undeniable evidence against years of practiced talking points. The reaction was instant. Members of the committee leaned forward, whispers rippled through the room, and across social media, people began sharing clips of the exchange within minutes. Viewers didn't just see a heated debate, they witnessed what happens when facts collide with polished rhetoric, and the outcome shocked everyone watching. But here's the bigger question. Why did this single moment matter so much? Because it wasn't simply a clash of personalities. It was a turning point where accountability stepped into the spotlight. Pam Bondi had built her reputation on defending positions that often avoided direct answers, but Crockett's approach stripped away every shield and demanded clarity. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was historic because in politics, silence often says more than words ever can. Think about it this way in a political arena, where arguments usually go back and forth endlessly. How rare is it to see one side completely unable to respond? That silence was a signal. It showed the audience that truth still holds weight, even in a time when distractions and narratives often drown it out. That's why the clip spread so quickly. People aren't just drawn to conflict, they're drawn to authenticity, and Crockett's evidence gave them that in real time. And here's where it gets even more interesting. This moment wasn't only about two individuals, it was about what? Congress is supposed to represent truth, accountability, and the responsibility of elected officials to answer tough questions. For many watching it was a reminder that government hearings aren't just performances for cameras. They're supposed to be platforms where real issues are addressed and real answers are demanded, and when those answers don't come, the silence becomes the story. So, as we break down this shocking exchange, you'll see why this wasn't just another viral clip, but a defining chapter in how accountability works in American politics. Because this wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't staged, and it certainly wasn't expected. It was raw, it was real, and it exposed more than one person's unpreparedness. It exposed the gap between what the public deserves and what they often receive. That's where our journey begins. One powerful exchange, one set of documents, and one unforgettable silence that shook a room spread across the nation and forced everyone to pay attention. To understand why this moment between Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett carried such weight, we need to step back and trace the paths that brought them into the same room. Pam Bondi's name is not new in American politics. She first rose to national attention as Florida's Attorney General, serving from 2011 to 2019. Where she gained a reputation for high-profile cases and outspoken positions. Over the years, her role expanded beyond state politics. She became a familiar face in national discussions, often appearing on major networks and later playing a role in political defense teams. During critical moments in Washington, her style was polished, confident, and usually reinforced by years of legal and political experience. For many, Bondi represented the establishment's ability to stay steady under pressure. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, comes from a different political generation. A sharp rising, Democratic representative from Texas, Crockett made her name through a combination of legal skill and direct communication. She is known for her no-nonsense questioning, her insistence on facts, and her ability to connect those facts to larger issues that matter to everyday Americans. Crockett's presence in Congress reflects a shift toward younger, more outspoken lawmakers who refuse to let tradition or seniority silence them when accountability is on the line. Now, imagine these two figures sitting across from each other in a hearing room. Bondi, seasoned and practiced, prepared to deliver statements with the confidence of someone used to the spotlight. Crockett, determined and armed with documents that had been carefully reviewed and prepared, ready to cut through talking points with precision. This wasn't a casual meeting. It was a clash of backgrounds, styles, and approaches to power. The setting itself added gravity. Congressional hearings are more than routine gatherings. They are public stages where the nation watches its leaders question witnesses, review evidence, and push for answers on issues that impact millions. The stakes are always high, but when the exchange is broadcast live, the pressure multiplies. Every pause, every word, and every reaction becomes part of the public record. In this case, viewers didn't just see a debate, they witnessed a rare unraveling of a figure who was expected to stand firm. Leading up to the moment, the hearing followed a familiar rhythm. Members asked questions, answers were given, and debates formed around policy and practice. But then came Crockett's turn. She didn't just rely on speeches or speculation. She placed documents into the record, physical proof that challenged the narrative Bondi had presented. In politics, words can be debated endlessly, but documents carry a different weight. They are tangible, verifiable, and difficult to dismiss without explanation. This is where the shock began to build. Bondi, usually quick to respond, found herself at a loss. The documents didn't just present an alternative perspective, they contradicted her position. What made the moment even more striking was that this wasn't a matter of opinion. It was a matter of evidence, and the silence that followed made it clear to everyone in the room. Why does this matter beyond the hearing room? Because it illustrates a deeper point about accountability in government. For years, many Americans have grown frustrated with politics that feel like performances rather than problem-solving. Hearings often appear scripted with questions designed to score points and answers, prepared to dodge responsibility, but what Crockett did was different. She disrupted the script. She forced the room to focus on facts, not just narratives, and in doing so, she reminded the background of this moment also connects to larger themes in American politics. The clash wasn't just between two individuals. It symbolized the struggle between old approaches to power and a new demand for transparency. Bondi represented years of political insulation, where seasoned figures could navigate tough questions with polished rhetoric. Crockett represented a shift where younger lawmakers are less interested in preserving appearances and more focused on exposing inconsistencies and demanding. It's important to recognize that moments like these don't come out of nowhere. They are built on months of preparation, research, and commitment to holding power accountable. Crockett's decision to present documents was deliberate. She knew that facts would carry more impact than speeches alone, and she trusted that the truth once placed before the committee would speak louder than any counter-argument. That's why the silence from Bondi mattered so much. It wasn't just hesitation, it was an acknowledgement. By understanding the history of both figures, the culture of congressional hearings, and the public's hunger for authenticity, we can see why this exchange spread so widely and resonated so deeply. It wasn't just about one political point scored. It was about restoring faith that truth still matters in the halls of power. And that's why this background is essential. Because it sets the stage for the scandal, the escalation, and ultimately the turning point that would come next. The moment the scandal broke, the room changed instantly. What had started as another congressional hearing suddenly shifted into something unforgettable. The turning point came when Representative Jasmine Crockett, calm but firm, laid out the documents she had prepared. Up until that moment, Pam Bondi had managed to maintain control, relying on her polished delivery and experience to navigate difficult questions. But this was different. These were not rhetorical questions or political jabs. These were deep. The air in the chamber grew heavy. Every eye shifted toward Bondi as Crockett walked through the pages line by line, showing the discrepancies. This wasn't a loud confrontation. There was no need for raised voices because the evidence spoke louder than any dramatic outburst could. Each sentence from Crockett was measured, deliberate, and clear. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. Her tone carried the weight of preparation and the certainty that comes from knowing the truth. Is on your 4 years, Bondi had been respected for her ability to defend herself in high-pressure situations. Whether it was during her time as Florida's Attorney General or in her later public roles, she built a reputation as someone who could hold her ground. But the scandal that unfolded in this hearing stripped away that image in real time. Each page Crockett presented pulled another thread, and soon the entire narrative Bondi had been trying to maintain began to unravel. The public reaction was immediate. Clips from the hearing started circulating, within hours spreading across social media, news outlets, and commentary platforms. What people saw was not just a political disagreement, but a rare moment of accountability. They saw a powerful figure confronted with evidence and struggling to respond. For viewers, it was a refreshing change from the endless cycles of talking points that so often dominate politics. Inside the chamber, the shift was palpable. Members who had been listening quietly leaned forward. The room, which had carried the usual noise of papers shuffling and side conversations, grew quiet as Crockett pressed forward. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't grandstanding. She simply let the documents tell the story. Every word was another nail in the coffin of the argument Bondi had prepared. The scandal broke, not because of a headline or a leak, but because the truth was presented in full view of the public. That's what made it so powerful. Everyone could see it. Everyone could hear it. There was no spin strong enough to erase what had been revealed in that moment. And that is why the exchange resonated far beyond the walls of Congress. The fallout for Bondi was not just about one hearing. It was about credibility. Once the documents came to light, questions about her past decisions and her reliability as a political voice became louder. The hearing served as a catalyst for deeper scrutiny, and journalists began revisiting old stories, re-examining past controversies, and asking whether the image she had carefully maintained still held any weight. For Crockett, the scandal was more than a political win. It was a defining moment. She demonstrated that preparation, evidence, and persistence could break through the noise of politics. In an era where so much is driven by performance and sound bites, her approach stood out because it was rooted in facts. She didn't need to exaggerate. She didn't need to insult. She simply exposed the truth, and the truth carried more weight than any speech ever could. What made this moment even more striking was the reaction from ordinary people. Many viewers who had grown skeptical of political hearings found themselves watching the full exchange, not just the highlights. Wanted to see every detail, every document, every reaction. That kind of engagement is rare, and it showed just how deeply this scandal touched a nerve. The scandal also underscored a broader point about politics today. For too long, these hearings and debates have felt like theater, where the outcome is predetermined and the words are crafted for headlines rather than truth. But when facts break through, when documents contradict talking points, the performance collapses. That's exactly what happened here, and it's why. This moment became so unforgettable. In the end, the scandal broke, because the truth could no longer be hidden behind rhetoric. Crockett's methodical approach made it impossible for Bondi to escape the weight of the evidence. And as the hearing moved forward, the tension only grew, setting the stage for the escalation that would follow. If the scandal breaking was the first crack in the wall, the escalation of evidence was the wrecking ball that brought it down. What began as a single set of documents quickly expanded into a layered case, each piece more damaging than the last. Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't simply reveal a problem. She revealed a pattern, and patterns in politics are impossible to dismiss. The hearing room shifted from tense curiosity to complete focus. Crockett walked the committee through emails, contracts, and financial records, each one carefully connected to the next. She wasn't dropping random pieces of information. She was building a staircase that led directly to a conclusion no one could ignore. Every time a new document appeared, the weight of the evidence grew heavier. Pam Bondi's confidence, once her strongest shield, began to falter. Early on, she tried to counter with polished talking points, deflecting attention away from the specifics. But the details Crockett provided weren't vague accusations. They were concrete, names, dates, numbers, the kind of material that can't be brushed aside with a clever line. As Crockett continued, it became harder and harder for Bondi to maintain composure. The escalation didn't just expose one questionable choice. It revealed a system of decision-making that raised serious concerns. One document showed inconsistencies in financial disclosures. Another highlighted conflicts of interest tied to past cases. Then came the emails, messages that contradicted public statements Bondi had made. Piece by piece, the narrative she had tried to build unraveled before the very eyes of the audience. What made the escalation even more powerful was the clarity of Crockett's delivery. She didn't overwhelm the room with jargon or drown the evidence in technical terms. Instead, she broke it down so that anyone watching, whether in the chamber or on a screen at home, could follow every connection. She explained why each document mattered and what it revealed about the bigger picture. This made the evidence not just compelling, but undeniable. By the time the second hour of questioning rolled around, the momentum had shifted entirely. Crockett had seized control of the narrative, while Bondi found herself on the defensive. Viewers at home could see the change in posture, the hesitations, the quick glances toward notes. It was no longer a debate between equals. It was a methodical dismantling, step by step. Social media amplified the escalation in real time. Clips of specific exchanges went viral, each new revelation sparking conversations across the political spectrum. The hearing became more than a congressional moment. It became a cultural event. Commentators debated the implications. Analysts dissected the documents, and ordinary citizens shared their reactions online. The weight of public opinion added another layer of pressure, making it clear that this scandal wasn't going to fade away quietly. What set this escalation apart from typical hearings was the way Crockett used anticipation. She didn't rush to show everything at once. She allowed the evidence to unfold gradually, each revelation building suspense for the next. It was almost cinematic, not because it was scripted, but because it followed the rhythm of truth being revealed piece by piece. The audience leaned in waiting to see what would come next, and Crockett never disappointed. The climax of this section came when a particularly damning document surfaced, one that directly contradicted a public statement Bondi had made just weeks earlier. This wasn't speculation or interpretation. It was black and white proof. The hearing room fell silent as Crockett read the line aloud, pausing only long enough for the weight of the words to sink in. For Bondi, it was the moment the floor seemed to drop out. For the audience, it was confirmation that the scandal was larger than anyone had for. The escalation of evidence did more than damage Bondi's credibility. It also highlighted the importance of transparency in government. If these documents hadn't been brought forward, the contradictions might have remained hidden. The fact that they surfaced in such a public way sent a message about accountability, one that resonated far beyond the individuals involved. By the time Crockett closed her binder, the outcome of the hearing felt inevitable. The evidence wasn't just stacked, it was overwhelming. Bondi's defense, once strong and rehearsed, now appeared fragile and unconvincing. The audience had witnessed the shift in real time, and the momentum had swung decisively against her. But Crockett didn't end the escalation with a victory lap. Instead, she left the room and the public with a cliffhanger. She hinted that the documents were just the beginning, that more revelations were on the horizon. It was a strategic move, one that ensured people would keep watching, keep asking questions, and keep the pressure alive. The escalation of evidence wasn't just a chapter in this story. It was the point where the scandal became undeniable. And with that undeniable truth came a demand for answers, setting the stage for the broader exposure of the system behind it all. Up until this point, the scandal had centered on Pam Bondi herself, her actions, her decisions, and her contradictions. But the real turning point came when Representative Jasmine Crockett shifted the lens from one individual to the larger network surrounding her. What had seemed like a personal controversy quickly grew into something far more consequential, a look at the system itself. This wasn't just about Bondi's credibility anymore. It was about how politics, power, and influence intersect in ways that affect not just a single official, but the entire structure of governance. The documents Crockett revealed painted a picture of connections that extended well beyond one office or one decision. They showed ties to lobbying groups, to financial interests, and to networks that operated behind the scenes. It became clear that this was not an isolated problem. It was part of a wider pattern. As Crockett laid out these connections, the mood in the hearing room shifted once again. What had begun as a pointed exchange now took on a heavier tone. The evidence showed how decisions that should have been made in the public interest may have been shaped by private interests. Instead, each link she exposed pointed to a larger web, one that revealed just how deep the influence of money and power runs in politics. One of the most striking aspects was the bipartisan nature of the connections. This wasn't a case that could be dismissed as partisan theater. The documents showed relationships and influences that crossed party lines, implicating figures from different corners of the political spectrum. That detail made the exposure even more significant because it wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans. It was about the system itself and how vulnerable it is to pressure from powerful players. Crockett's delivery carried weight because she didn't sensationalize the revelations. She spoke plainly, letting the evidence speak for itself. This clarity made the exposure more impactful. Oz viewers could see the scale of the issue without feeling overwhelmed by political jargon. Instead of abstract claims, there were tangible examples, contracts, financial reports, and communications that tied together in a way that no one could ignore. The public reaction reflected the gravity of this moment. People watching at home realized that this wasn't just about one person's misstep. It was about a culture that allows such missteps to happen and even rewards them. Citizens began to ask deeper questions. How many other officials were operating under similar influences? How many other decisions had been shaped in ways the public never knew about? The exposure of the system sparked not just outrage, but also a demand for greater transparency across. For Bondi, the shift in focus was devastating. As long as the scandal had centered on her alone, she could try to defend herself. spin the narrative, or argue the details. But once Crockett revealed that the issue tied into larger systemic problems, Bondi became just one piece of a much bigger story. Her defense no longer mattered as much because the audience was now looking at the structure around her. It was no longer just about what she had done. It was about how the system had enabled it. The magnitude of the revelations was amplified by the way Crockett framed their consequences for ordinary citizens. She explained how the influence of private interests affects everyday life, from policy decisions that shape the economy, to regulations that impact health, to laws that determine fairness and justice. By connecting the system's flaws to real-world outcomes, she ensured that the scandal didn't feel distant or abstract. It felt personal. It mattered. The visual imagery Crockett used also left an impression. At one point, she described the network of influence as a spitter's web, nearly invisible until you shine a light on it, and then impossible to unsee. That metaphor stuck with the audience because it captured both the complexity and the danger of the system. People could imagine how something so delicate-looking could be strong enough to trap even the most powerful figures in politics. By the end of this section, the hearing had evolved into something far larger than anyone anticipated. What started as a clash between two individuals had become an expose of systemic corruption and influence. The room grew quieter, the faces more serious as the weight of the revelations sank in. This wasn't just a scandal that would fade away after a few news cycles. This was the kind of exposure that leaves lasting marks, reshaping public perception of politics itself. But Crockett didn't stop at exposing the system. She made it clear that exposure alone wasn't enough. She set the stage for what had to come next, a reckoning. If the system had been revealed for what it was, then the natural next question was how to fix it and whether the people in power were willing to make that change. That challenge hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable as the section came to a close. The system was no longer hidden. It had been dragged into the light for all to see, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. The scandal had grown from a personal confrontation into a broader indictment of the way politics operates, and with that transformation came the demand for something even greater. Accountability, not just for one person, but for the entire system itself. The hearing had already taken on the weight of a systemic expose, but what happened next pushed it into its most dramatic moment. This was the turning point, the climax of the confrontation, where every thread of tension came together. Pam Bondi, under pressure, attempted to regain control of the narrative. She raised her voice. She tried to shift blame. She even attempted to dismiss the documents Jasmine Crockett had revealed. But the tide had already turned, and the moment that followed sealed the outcome. Crockett, calm and deliberate, leaned into the evidence with precision. Instead of matching Bondi's defensiveness, she cut through it with facts. Each sentence landed like a strike, short, sharp, and undeniable. She reminded the room that this wasn't about personal attacks, it was about truth. She emphasized that the documents weren't rumors, weren't speculation, but hard evidence that spoke for themselves. The crowd in the hearing room, already captivated, leaned forward as if bracing for what was about. Then came the defining moment. Crockett held up one final document, one that tied the threads together in a way that was impossible to ignore. It showed the connection between decisions Bondi had made in office and the private interests that had been quietly pulling strings. In that instant, the entire story shifted from allegation to confirmation. The room fell silent as Crockett read the line aloud, pausing only long enough for the weight of the words to sink in. For Bondi, it was the moment the floor. Bondi's reaction told the story more powerfully than words ever could. She froze, her arguments faltering, her expression caught between frustration and disbelief. For the first time in the hearing, she had no immediate response. The silence spoke louder than any defense could. The audience, both in the room and across the country watching the broadcast, understood what that silence meant. The truth had landed, and there was no way to walk it back. The climax of this drama wasn't built on shouting or theatrics. It was built on the steady, unwavering delivery of truth in the face of resistance. Crockett didn't need to humiliate Bondi with insults or exaggeration. The documents did that on their own, and the quiet confidence with which she presented them only magnified their impact. It was the kind of moment where power shifted, where the balance of credibility moved entirely from one side to the other. The reaction from the crowd reinforced that shift. Gasps echoed, followed by a buzz of whispered conversations that rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Cameras zoomed in to capture every detail. and even lawmakers who had remained quiet until that point exchanged looks that spoke volumes. The moment was undeniable. It wasn't just a turning point in the hearing, it was the kind of moment that becomes a turning point in public perception. Crockett delivered one final statement that crystallized the entire scandal. She said that when public officials place private interests above public trust, they fail the very people they were elected to serve. The words were simple, but the timing and the weight behind them gave them power. It wasn't just a conclusion to her presentation. It was a moral verdict, and in that verdict, the audience found clarity. For Bondi, the climax marked the point of no return. Any attempt at recovery after this moment would be seen as spin. Her credibility had been dismantled not by shouting matches or political theater, but by the undeniable presence of truth. The evidence stood on its own, and her silence only reinforced it. For the public, the climax delivered what they had been waiting for, a definitive moment of accountability. After hours of back and forth, of claims and counterclaims, here was a moment where the truth cut through the noise. It gave viewers something solid to hold on to, something that couldn't be dismissed as partisan argument. It was the kind of moment that sticks in memory, that people talk about long after the broadcast ends. The intensity of this scene highlighted not just the scandal itself, but the power of persistence and clarity in holding leaders accountable. Crockett's refusal to be intimidated, her calm delivery, and her reliance on evidence rather than theatrics set an example of what oversight should look like. It reminded the audience that accountability doesn't require spectacle. It requires courage and truth. The turning point didn't end with Bondi's silence, though. It carried forward into the reactions that followed. Lawmakers began to ask sharper questions, reporters pressed harder for answers, and citizens began demanding reforms. The climax didn't just expose one individual, it ignited a broader momentum for change. It was the spark that lit the fire of reform, and that fire would carry into the next stage of the story. This was the moment when everything changed. The scandal was no longer just a story of accusation and defense. It had become a story of truth, revealed, of accountability, demanded, and of power shifting in real time. And with that shift came a new reality. The system could not remain the same. The turning point had been reached, and nothing would return to how it was before. The turning point had changed everything. Pam Bondi's silence in the face of undeniable evidence left no room for defense. But the story didn't end there. What followed was just as important: the resolution, the reforms, and the lasting impact that came from this explosive moment in Congress. This was where outrage turned into action and exposure turned into accountability. In the days that followed the hearing, the public response grew louder. News outlets replayed the clip of Jasmine Crockett's final reveal again and again. Social media amplified the moment, with millions of viewers sharing their reactions. What stood out wasn't just the confrontation itself, but the clarity it provided. People weren't left wondering who was right or wrong. They had seen the documents, heard the facts, and witnessed the reaction. The truth had been made visible, and it was impossible to ignore. Lawmakers who had stayed quiet during the testimony began to step forward. Some called for further investigations, others demanded policy changes, and many acknowledged that the hearing had revealed deeper systemic flaws. This was no longer about one individual. The scandal had highlighted how unchecked influence, hidden interests, and a lack of transparency could corrode trust in government institutions. And that recognition pushed the conversation toward reform, the first wave used. Reform came in the form of stricter disclosure requirements. Lawmakers introduced new measures requiring public officials to reveal more about their financial ties and outside interests. The idea was simple. If sunlight could reveal hidden influences in Bondi's case, then sunlight should be the standard moving forward. Transparency, once a buzzword, now became a demand. Another reform focused on oversight itself. The hearing had shown how powerful it could be when representatives like Crockett asked tough questions and refused to accept half answers, but it also revealed how often those moments were rare. In response, committees began discussing ways to strengthen oversight to ensure hearings weren't just performances, but actual checks on power. This meant more resources for investigations, clearer standards for evidence, and stronger accountability for those who tried to mislead public trust, which had been shaken by years of scandals and controversies. Found a spark of renewal in this process. Ordinary citizens saw that the system, while flawed, could still work when people inside it had the courage to demand honesty. That shift in perception mattered. It reminded people that reform isn't abstract. It's about whether government serves the people or serves itself. The resolution also brought consequences for Bondi. While she denied wrongdoing, her credibility had been damaged in a way that could not be easily repaired. The documents spoke louder than any statement, and the silence in that pivotal moment had become a symbol of accountability, catching up. In politics, perception often carries as much weight as fact, and in this case, both aligned. Her influence declined and her role in public debate was diminished, but more importantly, the hearing empowered voices like Jasmine Crockett's. Her persistence had shown the power of preparation evidence and steady resolve. She became a symbol of how representatives could stand up to power without resorting to theatrics. That example inspired others, not just lawmakers, but citizens watching at home, who wanted to see more of that kind of leadership in action. As reforms gained traction, the conversation broadened to include systemic issues. It wasn't enough to focus on one official or one scandal. Citizens began asking bigger questions. How often does this happen? How many decisions are influenced by hidden interests, and what safeguards are truly in place to prevent it? Those questions fueled further debates, hearings, and proposals, ensuring that the scandal wasn't a one-time story, but a catalyst for lasting change. The resolution then wasn't just about punishment or exposure. It was about transformation. It showed how a single moment, a document revealed a silence that spoke volumes, could ripple outward into reforms that affect the entire system. That transformation mattered because it tied the outcome back to the people who are most affected, the citizens. For them, this wasn't just about headlines or political theater. It was about whether their voices mattered more than private interests. Hope entered the story here. After so much frustration with corruption and hidden influence, people saw a pathway forward. The reforms being discussed weren't perfect, and the system still faced challenges, but the hearing proved that accountability was possible. It proved that when truth is brought to light, change can follow. That sense of hope turned anger into empowerment, frustration into demand, and skepticism into action. In the months after the hearing, new legislation was drafted, watchdog groups gained more support, and citizens became more engaged in the process of oversight. It was clear that the impact of this confrontation extended far beyond the walls of Congress. It had set a new standard for accountability, one that citizens would expect to see again and again. The story of resolution and reform is never a neat ending. It's an ongoing process, one that requires vigilance and persistence. But this moment created momentum. It showed that exposure, when paired with courage, can lead to real consequences and real change. It reminded people that institutions don't reform themselves. They are reformed when individuals step up and demand it. As the resolution unfolded, the lesson became clear. Scandals may shake trust, but accountability can rebuild it. Reform isn't about perfection, it's about progress, and progress only happens when the truth is faced directly. No matter how uncomfortable it may be, the hearing may have started with confrontation, but it ended with transformation. That transformation gave people reason to believe that the system, despite its flaws, can serve the people when the people refuse to accept anything less, and that belief is the foundation of every reform that followed. This was not just a resolution to a scandal, it was a turning point for accountability itself. It showed that even in a system often clouded by doubt, transparency and truth can still break through. And when they do, they don't just expose the problem, they light the way toward reform. The hearing that began as a clash between Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett ended as something much bigger. It was more than a dramatic moment on the congressional floor. It became a lesson in accountability, transparency, and the power of truth to reshape public trust. And as the dust settled, 3 key lessons stood out, not just for Congress, but for all of us. The first lesson is simple. Truth matters even when it's uncomfortable. When Crockett revealed those documents, she didn't just win an argument. She reminded everyone watching that facts carry weight. In a world filled with spin soundbites and endless talking points, the evidence spoke louder than words. The lesson is that truth doesn't fade when confronted by power. It shines brighter, and it's our responsibility to demand that truth from our leaders, even when it exposes what they would rather keep hidden. The second lesson is about the importance of transparency. The scandal proved how easily trust can erode when leaders hide connections, interests, or financial ties. But it also proved how quickly transparency can rebuild trust when its enforced citizens don't expect perfection from their leaders, but they do expect honesty. And when transparency is the rule, accountability follows. The reforms that came after this hearing weren't abstract. They were real steps to ensure that citizens can see who their leaders. The third lesson is about the power of courage. It takes courage to stand up in a room full of powerful figures and demand answers. It takes courage to stay focused when the pressure is designed to silence you. And it takes courage to keep pushing when the easier option is to step aside. Crockett showed that courage in her example proves something vital. One voice, when armed with truth, can cut through the noise and inspire millions. Courage is contagious. It reminds us that the system can change when people in. These three lessons, truth, transparency, and courage, are the foundation of accountability. And they apply not only to Congress, but to every citizen who cares about the future of democracy. The story we've told here isn't just about Bondi Crockett or a single hearing. It's about the choices we all face. Do we demand honesty, or do we settle for half answers? Do we hold leaders accountable, or do we let scandals fade into headlines? Do we stay silent, or do we speak up when it matters? And that brings us to the call to action. If you've watched this story unfold, you know now that exposure matters, but action matters even more. Share the truth when you see it. Support reforms that increase transparency. Hold leaders accountable, not just during moments of scandal, but every single day. And most importantly, don't underestimate the power of your voice. Change doesn't begin in marble halls. It begins with ordinary people who demand better. As this story shows, accountability isn't given, it's taken, it's fought for. It's earned by persistence, by courage, and by refusing to accept anything less. And while the system may be flawed, the path forward is clear. When citizens unite around truth, transparency, and courage, reform is possible. So, let this hearing be more than a moment. Let it be a reminder that truth can cut through deception, that transparency can restore trust, and that courage can change the course of history. The story may have ended in Congress, but its lessons belong to all of us. I'll leave you with this. Accountability is not a gift from leaders to the people. It is a demand from the people to their leaders. Remember that quote, because it captures the heart of this story. Now, it's your turn. Stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay unafraid to demand the truth.